most of the people who were waiting initially in the waiting room have joined. I suspect there may be a few others who will join us, but I think we should get going. Welcome everyone. It's an absolute delight to see so many people giving up their afternoon or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are. I know there are some people from elsewhere other than South Africa and the UK who have registered at least. So thank you so much for giving up your time for this virtual book launch for what is, I think, kind of a fantastic new contribution to the history of the South African Communist Party. And is part of a series of events that History Workshop have been running alongside or rather in collaboration with the Communist Party to mark the centenary of the party itself. So this forms part of that series of events, but I think also is a special event that really is, marks an important contribution to that history. I will not say much more other than two key things. One is to thank the support of History Workshop, also to thank my colleagues at the University of Bristol for allowing me to usurp the departmental seminar slot on a Tuesday afternoon, but also to Jacana Media, who have helped support us in this event today. And I just want to very quickly mention before we get going that the Jacana have set up a special offer for people in South Africa for this event. I will in a second put the link into the chat, but there is, we discovered, we didn't know when we first set this up, but we discovered that all four of the panel participants are in fact Jacana authors. And I'll put a link in which will give you the option of buying any of the participants' Jacana books with a coupon code that will give you a 30% discount. So there's a discounted offer available to any of the participants, to any of the audience who wants to purchase any of the participants' books. The offer is valid until midnight this coming Sunday. So I'll just put that link in the chat in just a couple of minutes once we start off. But let's turn quickly now to Tom Lodge, who's going to start us off today. The outline of the session will be that each of the panelists will speak for roughly 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have a kind of a round of questions between the participants before opening up to questions from the audience, from our virtual audience today. So we'll start off with Tom, and in many respects, Tom, as with all of our panelists, need little introduction, I'm sure, to most of the people in the audience. But for those of you who may not be aware of Tom's background, he is Professor Emeritus of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Limerick, and also is Honorary Professor of Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He was formerly a member of staff in the Political Studies Department at Wits University between 1978 and 2005, and has written a huge number of really significant and important books on South African political history, including Black Politics in South Africa since 1945, Critical Life of Mandela, published in 2006, and Sharpeville, an Apartheid Massacre and Its Consequences, published in 2011. So without further ado, I will talk to Tom, who will provide us with a kind of context and framework and overview of his book over the next 10 minutes. So over to you, Tom. Thanks very much for joining us today. Sorry, Tom, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Robert. And I should say right at the outset, a couple of thank yous. If this was a conventional launch, one would spend half the time saying thank you to people, but that's not what you all took time off this afternoon to listen to. But I should actually thank both Robert and Ariana for organizing this session. And of course, all of you, including my fellow panelists, but those of you who are here listening at this very moment, for taking the time to do this. Until recently, just living to 100 was an achievement worth celebrating for itself. In England, as you all know, new centenarians receive a special card from their Queen. And perhaps the same convention is maintained in South Africa, and the party's 400,000 or so members can expect a birthday message from Cyril Ramaphosa, or maybe not. But in any case, these people have more to celebrate than their party's extreme old age. Though under the very tough conditions in which the party has existed, survival itself is an achievement, because next to the ANC, the South African Communist Party is the oldest political organization in Africa that still exists. But South African communists did more than outlive their rivals and their opponents. I argue in my book that they can make very strong claims to have shaped South African history decisively. Now, I'm not going to go into these arguments in any great detail, but I should just refer to them at least in outline. In which ways have the South African communists impacted on their country's history? Well, first of all, they initiated political solidarities that cut across South Africa's racial and social cleavages. And they began doing this from the party's formation in 1921, when it began recruiting Black South Africans. A point here, by the way, that's part of an autocritique, if you like, of the book, is in the book I rely very heavily on autobiographical writing by South African communists. But in the way that these things happen, much of that writing is by white South African communists, and there's still a shortage, though it's a shortage that is less acute now than used to be the case, of confessional writing by Black South African politicians and Black South African left-wing politicians in particular. 10 years later, after 1921, there were Black people leading the party and joining it in thousands. And the party's commitment to cross-racial politics, it wavered every now and then, but even so, it supplied real-world evidence that Black and white South Africans could share political goals and work towards them together. In the early 1930s, as early as 1931, the first white communists were convicted and served prison sentences for sedition, that is, for attempting to mobilize Black followers. Today, in South Africa, communists can take a considerable portion of the credit for the extent to which the country's politics are non-racial. Secondly, in terms of shaping South African history, modern South Africa has one of the strongest labor movements in the developing world, a movement that still, to a certain extent, shapes government policy. Now, the historical gestation of this movement, it's a very complicated story. And communists were not by no means the only labor pioneers. But in the early 1930s and 1940s, people like the recently disembarked Lithuanian immigrant Ray Alexander assembled industrial unions that would constitute enduring foundations for what was to follow. Some of today's most powerful trade unions can trace their genealogy back to her efforts in particular. Communists in the 1940s, such as the Port Elizabeth dry cleaning worker Raymond Plummer, worked out a strategy of alliances beginning with community protests to support strike movements. And this coalition between labor leaders and community activists would persist through the next 5 decades, helping to enable national liberation in 1994. Now, in fact, at a local level, trade unionists were community leaders in the 1940s, as well as belonging to the Communist Party. And in the vicinities in which they were busiest, in New Brighton, for example, in the townships dispersed along the East Rand, or in Cape Town's Langa, these leaders and their activist communist following in the 1950s, after the party's prohibition, continued to organize and mobilize. And it's no coincidence that where the ANC had the most entrenched and systematic presence in the 50s, it was in the localities in which communists were best organized in the 1940s. In short, the decade of defiance of the 50s, that in many ways provided a kind of template and source of inspiration for the mass defiance of the 1980s. The decade of defiance in the 1950s was incubated in party networks. Now, there are many other ways, and I detail them in the book, in which the party stamped its historic imprint. If the armed struggle was decisive, it was certainly important in inspiring other kinds of political action during the 80s, then communists supplied many of the key members of its general staff and field commands. Communists also played an important role, though it's one that I think is still, even after the work that I did on it in the book, a role about which one can ask questions. Communists played an important role in coordinating and developing some of the internal political activity of the 80s as well. From the 1920s onwards, through its night schools and other training facilities, the party educated successive echelons of South Africa's political leadership. That the ANC today in its internal discourses still uses the jargon, the language, the phraseology, the lexicon employed by the party's commissars in the Angolan training camps 40 years ago is testimony to their enduring effectiveness as educators. Earlier than any other South African political movement, the Communist Party brought women into leadership. And the pioneers whom the party should be recalling on its birthday include key women, Rebecca Bunting, Josie Mpama, and I'm delighted to see that with us today is the author of a wonderful new biography of Josie Mpama, Bob Edgar, Molly Walton, Dora Tamana, Betty Dutoy, Ruth First. Is it just history, though, that the party is celebrating this year? What about today and recent events? Communists have held important positions in ANC governments for nearly 30 years. They can count their membership today in hundreds of thousands, not just hundreds. But are they still shaping history? South African communists argue that their participation in government makes a real difference, reinforcing its commitment to public employment programs, to reindustrialization, to better foreign trade policies, to increased financial aid for students. And I'm sure the list is much longer. But they also concede that much of their effort is undone by political corruption and bureaucratic inefficiency, that they've failed to shift the government's neoliberal macroeconomic policies significantly. They do suggest that they play a role in limiting public venality, and this may be true, though initially they helped to defend President Zuma against his critics, as well as contributing to his victory at Polokwane. Does their membership really matter? The party's following doesn't constitute a disciplined electoral bloc, either within the ANC's own internal voting procedures, nor in national or municipal polls. Nor is it a membership that draws solidarity from its participation in manufacturing in the classic Marxian sense. One of the largest social groups from whom the party recruits today is young unemployed people, a group that keeps growing, sadly. The party's present strategic purpose is about building capacity for socialism. And in following this course, it's fair to say that its present challenges are as formidable as anything it's confronted in the past. Because then arguably, in the past, arguably South Africa's developmental trajectory, its history as an industrializing country was on the party's side. Today, I think things are much more uncertain. And the history that I was writing is still a history that's still being made. Thank you.
Tom, thank you very much indeed for that opening, starting us up this afternoon. We will now turn to our panelists who will offer their own thoughts on Tom's book before we just, as I said before, we'll take a kind of a round of responses from Tom to the panelists before opening up questions. So we're going to begin with Paula Jordan, who again, as I said, for Tom is unlikely to need introduction to many of you, but just briefly, born into a highly political family in South Africa, worked in London for the ANC during the 1980s, became a member of the ANC's National Executive Committee in 1985, returned to South Africa in 1990, and played a prominent role in the ANC during the period of negotiation, and then was a government minister under both Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki's administrations. And has published many works on contemporary South African history, including the very recently published book Breakthrough on the secret negotiations that led South Africa to the negotiating table, co-authored with Mark Maharaj. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us for our panel discussion today. Over to you for your contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much. Firstly, I want to congratulate Tom Lodge on what must have been a very tough job. 100 years of the SACP. I would imagine that was a pretty tough job to write that. The one issue which I wanted to pick up, and which I think needs to be underscored in terms of the history of the South African Communist Party, is the extent to which the South African Communist Party was very much a creature of the European socialist movement in its early years. And that is reflected in much of the confusion and perhaps muddled policy direction in the early years, and much of the toing and froing that happened during those early years. The second thing which I think one wants to emphasize is that I think, unfortunately, Tom Lodge did not make those connections as strongly as he should have. There is the phenomenon of what is referred to usually as white laborism. And it might look like something which is uniquely South African. But if one looks at the history of the working class movement in Europe, you'll find that what became white laborism in South Africa was present already in the First International. There is the spat between John Hales, one of the English members of the First International, and Freddie Engels, which ends in Engels denouncing Hales as, in terms, I suppose, which would have been found very comfortably in the Moscow trials, virtually refers to him as an agent of British imperialism, because Hales shared many of the prejudices that the English workers had towards the Irish workers. Ironically, of course, Irish workers, when they came to South Africa, that, I suppose, plight of chauvinism, of white chauvinism, came with them, and they acted in the same manner towards African colored and Indian workers. The significant dimension of the history of the party, I think, and perhaps which tends to be somewhat underplayed and sometimes misrepresented, is the Sixth Congress of the Communist International. And with respect to that, I think there are a number of corrections one has to make in what Tom Lodge has written. The process actually begins at the Second Congress with Lenin's thesis on the national and colonial question, which is debated with Roy. But the significant thing about the Sixth Congress, A, is that there is a build-up towards it in the Fourth and the Fifth Congresses of the Communist International. And what is often overlooked is one of the keynote addresses made, interestingly, by Palmiro Togliatti, then using the party pseudonym Ercole at the Sixth Congress. I think it would do Tom a great deal of good if he looked at that keynote address, because many of the themes which you then find in the thesis on South Africa, I think have their origin in Togliatti's speech. And the significance of the Sixth Congress is that it does away with two things which the South African communists brought with them from Europe. The first was an assumption which is repeated a number of times, and Lodge has noted all those instances, interestingly. The assumption that it would be the white workers who would lead any revolution in South Africa, and as the ISL used to say, would then grant the natives whatever rights they are capable of claiming. What the Sixth Congress did was to overturn that conventional wisdom and say, no, it's not going to be the white workers who are going to be the revolutionary agent in South Africa. It's going to be the Black majority. It also reorients the Communist Party away from a rather confused class struggle approach to the South African issue. And I think the really significant development in relation to the Sixth Congress is that it makes South African communists for the first time understand that the class struggle in South Africa will proceed through the national struggle. Why the Communist Party remains relevant today, and a whole host of other Marxist formations. And if you came from Cape Town, you would know we did have a host of Marxist formations in South Africa, have become totally irrelevant is precisely because of the Sixth Congress, which reoriented the party, and the Black Republic slogan that the party adopted as a result of the Sixth Congress is what has made it consistently relevant. To be sure, in the 1930s, there was the retreat from the Black Republic. And by the 1940s, even as late as 1950, when the party is about to dissolve, in its resolutions, it's clear that many of the party theoreticians have completely forgotten the Black Republic. But you do have subtle suggestion in those last resolutions in 1950, where there is, we find the quotation that South Africa has the characteristics of an imperialist country and a colonial country within the borders of one country, which is then repeated in the SACP's Road to South African Freedom in 1962. The significance of the Sixth Congress and the Black Republic is the construction the Sixth Congress put on the oppression of the Black majority in South Africa. You get it in Togliatti, you get it also in the thesis on the Negro question at the Fifth Congress, where it speaks of the African people and people of African descent all over the world, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, being colonial subjects or suffering under a status similar to that of colonial subjects. and it gives a Pan-African interpretation to what is happening in South Africa. Many of the critics of the Black Republic miss that completely. But ironically, many of its supporters also miss that. The second thing which one wants to say, and perhaps again, maybe that wasn't his mission in any case. The Third International, the Communist International, is the first attempt, real attempt, on the part of the movement inspired by Marx and Engels to build an international movement. The Second International, honestly speaking, was a Euro-American international at best. It was an international of white people. The Third International is the first attempt to actually build an international movement which embraces virtually every part of the world and takes as one of the principal causes that the communists are going to fight around the issue of colonial liberation. The Third International is also the only, well, I suppose to be generous, one has to say the First and the Second International were elements within those who genuinely wanted to overthrow capitalism and build a socialist future. But it is the Third International that actually seriously undertakes that task and devises a whole manner of instrumentalities and institutions in pursuance of that objective. And it is parties that arose and derived from the Third International, if we omit the Bolsheviks, that have actually been able to take on capitalist formations and attempt to build socialism, attempt to build post-capitalist societies. I think that too is very, very important to understand, because unless one integrates those into the narrative, the explanation, for example, of why the lexicon, the jargon, the vocabulary of the liberation movement, especially after 1915, tends to be borrowed from the left, is largely because of that. A, because of the Black Republic, and B, because the Third International seriously undertook the project of overthrowing capitalism. One other correction: the commissariat of MK was perhaps dominated by comrades who were in the Communist Party, but not everyone in the commissariat was a member of the Communist Party. That's a falsehood that's been spread by Stephen Ellis and other scoundrels, professional cold warriors. So let's be careful about getting carried too far about the influence of the party on the MK Commissariat. Having said that, one has to congratulate Tom Lodge on his scholarship. He has obviously worked very hard and dug into a whole number of archives and sources to put together this work. But perhaps one can talk about those later. I think I'll stop there right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. We will now turn to Jeremy Cronin, who has a kind of a long history of activism and excuse me, and membership of the South African Communist Party. Jeremy was part of the was elected to the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party in 1989. Was part of the South SACP delegation to CODESA negotiations and joint draft coordinator of the RDP. He then went on to the Deputy General Secretary of the SACP from 1995 to 2017, and has served as ANC NEC member from 1991 until 2012. You've been an ANC party MP until 2019, from 1989 to 2019, and Deputy Minister from 2009 and up to 2019. And you are currently the South African Communist Party Central Committee, South African Communist Party Central Committee and Political Bureau member. So thank you so much for participating, for joining. And I also know that you've been a key contributor to Tom's research process. So thanks so much for joining us, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Greetings to my fellow panelists. And let me begin where Paula began, which is to really congratulate Tom for, I think, what is a landmark scholarly achievement in dealing with 100 years and more, because you obviously also trace the early beginnings of the Communist Party in South Africa. Maybe I'll touch on some of it, largely in agreement with what Paula has said, but let me begin with where I was wanting to begin, which was to say that clearly the central theme, and I think that was said again in his brief introductory remarks, Tom's brief introductory remarks, is the hugely important, significant influence of the Communist Party on Black liberation struggles, particularly from 1945 going forward, and especially obviously on the ANC. And in doing this, on the one hand, Tom corrects and says so, and I think correctly so, a tendency in some of the earlier deep scholarly research, like the Carris and Carter volumes, which are, a huge and very useful resource, obviously, from protest to challenge, that the role of the party in this period, 1945 through, tends to be a bit diminished, but not significantly noticed. And as Tom correctly says in his writing, this was partly the result of the absence of resources which have now become available with the opening of Comintern archives, hundreds of largely, yes, unfortunately, white communists doing their autobiographies and biographies and so forth. But also, as I think he correctly suggests, these were liberal friends of the ANC. And it was good to have any kind of friend in that period, but we're not inclined really to look at the influence of the Communist Party, and inclined to believe that the ANC had an independence which would make it largely waterproof to a communist influence. But on the other hand, in order to argue for this significant impact of the Communist Party, theoretically, but also in terms of organization and mobilization, he also obviously doesn't stray in the direction of the Cold War warriors, scholar journalists like R.W. Johnson and Stephen Ellis, who turn the party's impact and influence on the ANC into a kind of manipulative entryism on behalf of Kremlin bosses, essentially. That was obviously a line taken by the apartheid regime for all the obvious reasons, but was also basically developed in a much more sophisticated way by people like Stephen Ellis. And I think Tom very usefully, I think, picks a very useful and I think constructive way through those two extremes. And I think a lot has to do with what I find amongst the most interesting things about Tom's approach to this history. And it's his interest in the sociology of the party, if I could call it that. And despite the party's often proclaimed pretensions or aspirations to be a vanguard, Leninist, democratic centralist formation, which it's sometimes been, I guess, but often it's not that. And I think it has to do with this interesting, complex internal sociology of the party, which has to do with many things. The first obvious thing would be its non-racial diversity from its very beginnings. And as Paula has correctly stressed, and I think Tom also does, it was not a non-racialism that was perfect. and needed to grapple with the realities. I mean, there's that wonderful phrase that you've got on his name's escaped me, I shouldn't. The first chairperson of the Communist Party in South Africa, whose inclinations, psychological habits and so on were with a white industrial working class, but who theoretically could accept that proletarians also might be black. So there's this ethnic and racial diversity of the Communist Party, which is quite unique. But also there are these profound gaps in time, periods in which the party is growing and periods in which the party is stagnating or is deeply involved in fragmentation and early 1930s internecine factionalism and so forth, which then create interesting gaps. So I think for me, one of the interesting gaps, which also then relates to spatial distances and diaspora, very marked obviously during the period mid-1960s through the 70s and 80s, when the key party leadership is in exile. But even more interestingly, and that comes through well in stuff that Ariana Lisoni has written, but also in Tom Lodge's book, that there's also there are two centers, actually, two SACP centers, with the non-African party leadership unable in the late 60s and first half of the 70s to base in Africa and therefore form around a London center, with the general secretary and chairperson of the party, Africans based in Dar es Salaam, and two quite distinct cultures and tensions start to develop inside of the party, with those in London believing that the African party leadership has become more ANC than party, and I'm sure the alternative view was that they were risking the importance, critical importance at the time, which it certainly was, of rebuilding a fractured and dispersed ANC, and that being too communist in that space, was risking. So I think more could have been made of some of the other divisions, and particularly what opened up in the 1980s between an internal SACP in formation, parts of the external SACP, I mean, outliers like Harold Walpy and Ruth First, who were very much active, both academic as well as party participants in the New Left and engagements with a left Eurocommunism, which became also very important inside of the SACP in the course of the 1980s, and in general had an important influence on the mass democratic movement. So the important gap, I think, in this early history is perhaps an insufficient, while the impact of the party on the ANC is, I think, well documented and, obviously pleasing for someone like myself who has been in the Communist Party for a long time. But I think insufficient thoughtfulness is perhaps devoted to the impact of the ANC on the Communist Party. This long-standing and complicated relationship and overlapping leaderships and overlapping memberships, I think, has had a profound impact on the character of the South African Communist Party as well. So, it's not just in the folkloric use of choral singing. A progressive communist from Europe observed one of our SACP congresses in the 1990s and was, I think, a bit surprised to see that the congresses were full of singing, basically, okay? And the singing is not just incidental, it's a way of expressing, telling the leadership that the membership is dissatisfied, advancing slogans, different factional differences are explored in song and so forth. So, I mean, that would be one example. Obviously, the drawing on Christian emancipatory language and lexicon is something which was not just peculiar to the ANC, but also to the Communist Party, and helped to ground it in a whole range of traditions of self-help, of survival, coming from pre-colonial resistance and through into the post-colonial thing. Now, there's, I mean, to give one example, which comes through beautifully in one of the anecdotes that Tom tells, is obviously that fascinating story about Elliot Tongeni, Bransby Ndorbe, and Johnny Gomez. So I think most of the participants will be aware that they were communists and key leaders in the very militant, mass-based ICU, but were expelled because of their party membership in 1928. And what they then did is they didn't stop organizing basically rural farm workers, in this case in the Boerland outside Cape Town. But what they set up was ANC branches, interestingly, not Communist Party branches, but ANC branches, organized particularly very successfully colored farm workers in the Worcester area. Elliot Tongeni in particular was very successful and led a series of militant marches through the town of Worcester. It was met with police resistance, 5 people were killed and so on. And a very conservative Cape ANC expelled Tongeni and Ndorbe from the ANC. And what did they do? They didn't then set up SACP branches, CPSA branches. What they did was they set up an ANC, independent ANC, okay? Obviously believing that an ANC kind of approach was the appropriate one, but it just needed to be a lot more militant than the rather docile and respectable Cape leadership of the time. Now, all of this is of interest because then Tongeni gets banished to the Eastern Cape, to the rural Eastern Cape. And as Tom says, this banishment simply displaced his activism. And he continued to organize an ANC independent movement in this. Now, all of this is of interest to the Communist Party and its history, because in 1934, the future long-serving Moses Kotane, long-serving General Secretary of the party, Moses Kotane, in deep frustration with what was going on in the Communist Party in the early 1930s with Stalinist purges and factionalism of all kind, and with the party's very future at risk. He went and based in the Eastern Cape area, in Craddock, amongst other places, and came across these ANC independent organized branches, some 6, in places like Takastad and Craddock, and then penned his famous letter, famous certainly within the SACP, to the Joburg district leadership saying, you know, you're all debating about Stalin and the German question and Trotsky and so forth. And yes, that's of interest. But for heaven's sake, there's a reality here on the ground in South Africa, and there are people organizing. They're even communists, but they're organizing in another framework. So I think that helped the point that Paolo is making, which is that I agree with Paolo. I think the 6th Comintern and the Cominterns that preceded were incredibly important for the Communist Party to ground itself not just organizationally and in a language and so on, but strategically in the reality of South Africa. But paradoxically, I think 1928, the 6th Comintern, and the 1929 adoption, reluctant adoption of the thesis, of the Black Republic thesis, came and went, partly with the Comintern going on its left deviation, and partly the Communist Party also losing the plot in terms of that strategic perspective. Coming towards an end, the last sort of point I want to make, but it then is related to these other points, is that Tom framed, I think, Tom, and understandably, the last chapter, in my view, is the least successful. And no doubt because it's hard to deal with a fluctuating situation. But I think one of the problems with it is that it's framed as post-communism. Now, we all know what you mean, and obviously the party had its nose rubbed in what you're referring to, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, disappearance of the Berlin Wall and so forth. But I think that a more effective framing might have been triumph of global financialized capitalism, of neoliberalism, not just as an ideology, but as a new stage of capitalism. Because what happens through the 80s and high water mark 1990 is not just the rolling back collapse, basically, of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc of countries. But the two other relatively progressive streams that had occurred after the defeat of fascism in 1945, what Samir Amin, I think, very usefully describes as the three historical compromises of the post-1945 period. One of which would obviously be welfarism, social accords, implicit or explicit, in the most of the developed capitalist countries. So significant advances for trade unions, progressive forces, social democratic parties, and so forth, in the context of the defeat of fascism. And then, of course, decolonization and the flourishing of the non-aligned movement, the Bandung movement, and so on, and some very radical national liberation movements, Vietnam or whatever. Now, through the 80s and by 1990, and this is the paradox of the SACP in 1990, is the very reference point that it has had, for better and for worse, and I think sometimes in clumsy and unfortunate ways, the Soviet Union has disappeared, has evaporated. But on the other hand, the Communist Party is at the height of its popularity inside of South Africa. So a series of contradictory things happen. So the leadership that was elected it wasn't Havana, by the way, it was in Matanzas in Cuba at the party's 7th Congress in 1989. Key members of that leadership resign a few months later in 1990, quietly from the Communist Party. And they include two future presidents, Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma. And they obviously also believe that it's a post-communist world, and clearly believe that the parties are irrelevant, basically, in the situation, certainly confronting South Africa in 1990. And Mbeki in particular then plays a very active and anti-party role. I don't think that that's sufficiently acknowledged in seeking to marginalize the Communist Party. And I think that Mbeki basically, and not alone, believes that 1990 South Africa and 1994 South Africa basically is going to be a Germany or France 1945, welcomed into, the global order, receive martial aid, so to speak, and basically be welcomed. And of course, there was a lot of reasons to have that illusion, including the fact that South Africa was the poster child of the third wave of democratization, this new rainbow nation, the iconic celebration of Mandela, and so forth. But also related to that, there was a mistake made, in my view, that the support that existing established white monopoly capital in South Africa had very much supported the negotiation transition, was going to also then translate into a social accord, basically, with the new political reality. And that was furthest from the mind of established monopoly capital in South Africa, who had been locked in to South Africa by sanctions, UN sanctions, but also by the defensive exchange control and other measures taken by the apartheid regime. And for them, the political settlement was an opportunity to embark upon the globalization process, pursuit of cheap labor markets globally, with the lifting of sanctions and so forth. So of course, they promised that they would contribute to reindustrialization, that they would contribute to investment, that they would be prepared to support some kind of social accord. But in practice, they said, but all of that would require essentially the imposition of a neoliberal shock therapy, which duly arrived in 1996, unconsulted within the ANC, let alone with its broader alliance. So I think and the subsequent realities are that then perhaps the very last point I want to make is, because the question arises, if the parties had this wonderful and important impact on the ANC, how do we explain the current reality? And what sort of responsibility should the party take for an ANC which, by its own admission, is now in deep trouble? It still retains, a not insignificant electoral support, but it's waning. But it's an ANC also that is ridden with challenges of corruption, factionalism. ANC candidates are getting shot literally as we approach the local government elections and so on. And we have the soaring unemployment and poverty. So I think that in order to understand, and obviously I can't now, and I've used up more time than I should have been allotted. I think that we need to understand the trajectory of the Communist Party, which I think has had its own difficulties, and I think you've pointed to some of them. A large membership, but how effective is that membership, and so forth. But let me then conclude by saying that whatever the shortcomings, this is a hugely important key resource for the debate, the critical discussion that we need to have amongst all of us, not least within the Communist Party and beyond it. And it's a discussion that needs to be both academic and activist. It's a huge and positive resource, I think, in enabling what is so important for South Africans, but hopefully also for all those who are interested in a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Our final panelist this afternoon is Professor Janet Cherry, who's Professor of Development Studies at Nelson Mandela University, who's author of Umkhonto Sizwe, History of MK, and contributor to 4 volumes, so a hugely important contributor to the Road to Democracy in South Africa series of edited collections. So Janet, thank you very much for agreeing to participate, and over to you.
Thank you, and good evening, everybody. I'm sure, Jeremy, that we're going to have to come back in discussion to your input about the transition and the current situation, but you should have actually gone last, of course, and you were right, because I'm going to go back a little bit to the 80s. I want to say, firstly, Tom, I found the book really, really fascinating and readable. You know, even though it's very dense and very complex and covering a huge period of time, it's really readable and accessible, which makes it very useful. I wanted to focus a little bit on the relationship between the SACP and the ANC, and between the SACP and ANC underground and the mass movement, both the labor movement and the UDF, and look at its influence in terms of strategy primarily, but also a little bit in terms of ideology and organizational culture. And I think overall that, Tom, you got it right. And I read what you're saying is that there were limits to the party's influence, which was dispersed, and it was dispersed precisely because of the nature of the liberation struggle in South Africa and the different centers of organization in exile and in Southern Africa and internally. So I think, you know, by the 1980s, what you write is that the presence of the SACP inside South Africa was limited and scattered and not coherent. Party cadres weren't accountable to a collective. And it was absolutely correctly the policy not to act as a caucus within allied formations, but rather to work as individuals within the liberation movement and all the different components of it, a very complex movement. So there's a party document quoted in 1981, which says that no party, group or collective had discussed the recent reorganization of the ANC of its apparatus responsible for internal military and political work. So what does that mean? What actually happens as a result of that? Well, the party did not function as a separate collective entity within the ANC leadership, as is described in the book. And there clearly are implications in that for the strategy that emerged and what influence the SACP had on strategy. There were clearly tensions between military strategy, insurrectionary strategy, and a strategy of building a mass movement, labor movement, factory units, organs of people's power, and in some cases, those leading to negotiations at various levels, from local government, local business, right up to national and international negotiations. I've got a slight criticism of when you reach the point of the establishment of the UDF as referring to the UDF emerging independently of the ANC's own underground organization. and in some respects substituting for the ANC's internal reconstruction following the Green Book blueprint. I don't think that's quite accurate. And I mean, I know in all major centers I'm familiar with Durban, Cape Town, without doubt, that ANC underground activists were involved in the formation of the UDF. And the strategy of the UDF itself was influenced by party members, including Jeremy Cronin, who's sitting here. And he and other people were drawing on a wider strategic framework than one would understand by reading the sort of Marxist-Leninist theory of revolution and vanguardist theory and so on. So we were drawing on Gramsci, for example, and I'm sure Jeremy would talk more about this. The idea of delegitimizing the Black local authorities, which were being established at that time. And what did that mean? So let me give you an example of this and how the strategy played out, and how it's reflected in the book, which I found very, very interesting. I'm going to look at Cradock as an example. And Jeremy referred to an interesting case of Cradock organization in previous decades. So in Cradock, he refers to Matthew Goniwe as being one of the UDF leaders who were party members, which is true. And Matthew became the regional organizer for the UDF, setting up these structures in many small townships around the Eastern Cape. So he cites Menzi Duka in a recent paper, 2018 paper, saying that Matthew Goniwe was part of a Communist Party unit that was set up by Chris Hani when he was based in Lesotho. And then in another part of the book, there's a reference to how Hani set up these 3-person units in the Eastern Cape. And interestingly enough, they refer to how they blurred the roles of the SACP and the ANC, which Raymond Suttner also talks about, how there was no clear distinction in terms of their function. Again, it's not clear whether Hani was setting up military units, MK units, or whether he was setting up units which were tasked with political tasks, or with Sacp working within factories. And if there were Sacp units, what were they meant to be doing? Were they meant to be arming the workers, playing a military role, or were they meant to be forming strong labor organizations, etc.? So there's this complete, can we say, overlapping of roles and functions. And the strategy is not absolutely clear. But I think what I like is what Tom refers to as the UDF being a complicated organization, not all committed insurrectionists, and people working under ANC or SACP discipline being unevenly or intermittently present in its hierarchy. So what you see is somebody like Matthew Goniwe, who let's assume that he was in a party unit, was actually developing very innovative strategies to contest power at local level and creating these structures of popular power. How did that fit into some grand vanguardist insurrectionary strategy of the Communist Party? Well, it actually didn't really. I mean, although one can then debate how the struggle played out in the 80s, what kind of pressure was put on the regime to come to the negotiating table and so on. But it certainly can't be seen as something which was controlled by a vanguard, in the sense that, you know, a typical Leninist party would understand its management of a revolutionary strategy. So I also found a very interesting quote from Hadland and Rantau, who say the ANC was startled by evidence of its ideological authority within the UDF, which I found quite strange, because I didn't find it, I don't think the ANC would have found it startling, actually, given the way in which the UDF drew on the traditions of the ANC and of the party, you know, in its work. So just another point, a sort of last point about the strategy issue. You know, Tom argues in the book that the party's influence over the ANC strategic thinking was limited, despite its heavy presence in the leadership, because the party members themselves were not in agreement about strategy ultimately. So when it came to the end of the 1980s and the debates about insurrection versus negotiation, that there was some contention and there wasn't a clear position. So I just wanted to reflect on Paula, on your book, your and Mac's book. I mean, you hardly mention the SACP, and you could argue that, well, you know, if everybody was on the same page by 1989, then there's no need to disaggregate the SACP influence, you know, I mean, because everybody's thinking along the same line. But I did think it was then a little bit of a put down, Tom, in the end, to say this party, which is meant to be a revolutionary vanguard, that its strategic influence is seen as limited to being what you say is a source of hope and moral certainty. I mean, one would think that it would play more of a strategic revolutionary role in that. Shall I leave it at that? I could talk about culture a bit more, but I think I've said enough. I'll come back, Robert, if you want me to. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we will have some opportunity to probably to pick up further. And Janet, thank you so much for those questions, and thank you to all of our panelists for I think both a kind of very kind of generous and warm response, but also a challenging response to your book, Tom. I think what we'll do is we'll give you a few moments now to kind of reflect and respond to the comments that the other panelists have made, and in the meantime, and then after that, we will open up to questions from our audience. If you do have a question that you'd like to put to Tom, or comment or question, please could you use the chat function, and could you either just simply say speak, or I have a question, and I'll ask you to unmute. Or if you would prefer to type the question directly into the chat, then I can then read it out for you. So if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat function to make me aware of that, and I will pick them up. But first of all, Tom, you should have a right to respond to the panelists. Thank you.
Well, very, very briefly, if all my readers have the same intellectual generosity and resourcefulness in getting to grips with my arguments, looking at them critically, I'll be very lucky indeed. Specifically on Paula Jordan's points, absolutely right. I mean, white Laborism was very much an international movement. It wasn't incubated in South Africa. It traveled with the men and women who brought it to South Africa from Australia, from California, from Britain, and elsewhere. But it wasn't the only movement that animated, if you like, the thinking and the responses of white South African communists in the early 1920s. The Jewish Bundist movement was also important and brought with it a very different range of consciousnesses. And to a certain extent, I pay quite a lot of attention to the complexity of those early groups. I perhaps find some of the white Laborites more interesting than Paula Jordan does. I find that people like Bill Andrews genuinely struggle in, if you like, the politics of the head and the politics of the heart. And I find that struggle interesting, and I find his own confessional writing honest and attractive in certain ways. I think actually we're more in agreement on the Comintern and the Sixth Congress. I'll certainly look at Togliatti's speech and the build-up to those to the Black Republic resolution and its impact in South Africa. I think part of the problem was that the impact was weakened, of course, by its constant reshift and redefinition in the years that followed 1928. But I would generally agree with the point that the extent to which the South African Communist Party, or the Communist Party of South Africa as it was then, became an African movement owed much to the Black Republic and the party's own attempts to grapple with it. And if one looks at the South African Party comparatively and contrasts it with other colonial parties or other parties that operated in similar settings, for example, in Algeria, if we look in the African context, or the United States, if we go further afield, the history of the Black Republic isn't one necessarily of failure or of things going wrong, but over time things going rather better than you might have guessed if you read some of the very critical accounts of Comintern interventions in South Africa. If I argue that all members of the commissariat were communists, then it was careless phraseology. The parties in the 80s and late 70s concentrated a considerable amount of effort in recruiting in the commissariat, in the Umkhonto's commissariat, but obviously not every important Umkhonto person was in the party. But thank you, Paula Jordan. Plenty to think about when from your remarks when I write, as I hope I will be doing, the second edition. In many ways, Jeremy's comments represented a continuation of Paula Jordan's argument, I think the extent to which the ANC helped to shape the party after the party's engagement with it is actually a fascinating question that I don't spend enough time thinking about or looking at, and it's one that I think would repay a great deal more research than I was able to do in the book on that particular issue. I think also if and when I look at the developments of the last chapter, I think the framing of it in the arguments, the international arguments about post-communism, probably is intellectually a bit confining. I do think that one of the things that needs more explanation than I give it is why the party didn't have a stronger idea of what social democracy could achieve under a capitalist, through a capitalist economy, and I think Jeremy's argument about the sort of significance of the 1990 era, that is that it wasn't just post-communism, it was the triumph of neoliberalism and the decline of Western-style social democracy, is an argument that would actually repay a lot more thought. Thank you, Janet, for your comments, I would still stand by my argument that the party was that the strategic direction of the party became increasingly hobbled by internal disagreements within its leading echelons. I think, though, that I will put a lot more thought if I were to rewrite the book or do a second edition in the into the sort of internal tensions that may have existed between different sections of the party and different parts of its intellectual life. And I thought her comments about the kinds of influences and the kinds of traditions that informed the work of internal activists in the 1980s who were engaging with the UDF those remarks I found completely compelling and very illuminating and rewarding, because I rather suspected that that might have been the case. So thank you all very much.
Tom, thank you. So please, we do have time for questions and comments. So please do, as I said, indicate by using the chat function, which you can find on the bottom of your Zoom screen if you're a member of the audience, to indicate that you have a question, or indeed to type your question if you would prefer to do it that way. Well, I see we have our first question. Anthony, you say you have 4 or 5 questions. As you are the first, you can certainly start off with your opening question, and we'll see how many you can get through before others post questions. So, Anthony, if you could unmute your microphone and pose your question, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much.
Right, I hope I'm unmuted. Tom, I've read it very fast, and there were 2 questions that struck me that I wanted to know the answer to. And one of them is how important Marxist theory has been in the activity of the South African Communist Party. And I was thinking in particular about what happened as the negotiated settlement approached. And there were really strikingly different interpretations of what could and should happen that I thought were informed by theory. And the second question, I won't ask all 5. The second question is that in a lot of to the limited degree that I've read this stuff, the things that I've read in the history of the South African Communist Party, there was an awareness of what might go wrong, and it seems that the party was largely unsuccessful at averting a series of developments that it had in fact predicted. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Good. Am I muted?
No, we can hear you.
Right. How important was Marxist theory in shaping the party's strategic approach? During the negotiations, or more generally, my feeling is that during the negotiations, I mean, I may be wrong, I don't think that, but you would need to ask them or look at their memoirs, but I don't think that the key party people that played a role in the negotiations had an approach that was particularly shaped by a sort of theoretical or an awareness of historical parallels that might be drawn from reading Marxist classics. Perhaps I'm wrong, and perhaps if they had been, things might have developed rather differently. But I mean, there are people on this panel who probably have a stronger sense of the answer to that question, and how conscious people were of theoretical issues when they were involved in the give and take of negotiations and the practical issues that arose during them. I mean, amongst the people that are attending today, there are some people who played absolutely key roles. So I'm rather hesitant to provide a very good answer to this. On the awareness of what might go wrong, I take it that again, you're referring to that crucial period of 1989 to sort of 1992, that kind of thing. Is that right, Anthony?
Well, I was thinking in part about predictions about the dangers of a new bourgeoisie.
Yes.
And its relationship with the state.
Well, I mean, the party spelt out its fears about negotiations through the 1980s, and I mean, people, for example, like Walpe, wrote sensitive and detailed analysis of the shifts that were taking place within ruling groups in South Africa, between the state and dominant groups in the economy, and within the state between different factions of the bureaucracy and political leadership. And they were very wary for that reason of the initial probes that were coming from the regime and from business groups, but at the same time they were suggesting that you couldn't deflect these probes or not or ignore them. I think that if one takes a longer term view, I think that party theorists tended to underestimate the likelihood of the emergence of a black bourgeoisie and the extent to which there were bourgeois or proto-bourgeois groups already within the political economy amongst black South Africans during the 1980s.
Tom, thank you. I wonder, we have a question from Robert Edgar, but before, would any of the other panelists like to comment on the question about Marxist theory that Anthony asked? Sure. Paula, go ahead, please.
Yes. There was, I think, a lot of wrestling led by people like Harold Walpe about the dangers of a black bourgeoisie emerging. You also had Toussaint in the African communists tackling the same issue. The problem was that in both cases, Toussaint and Walpe, they seemed to forget what the party program said about colonialism of a special type, did not, as a consequence, look at what was happening in South Africa in empirical terms. There was obviously an attempt by elements in the classes represented by the Urban Foundation and others to try to cultivate a collaborationist black bourgeoisie. But if you look at what had happened with the urban black petty bourgeoisie from the 1950s onward, led by the National Party to be sure, but supported by the UP and to a certain extent by the Liberals in what became the PFP, etc. The dominant capitalist classes went on a rampage to destroy what could have become a black bourgeoisie. The black property classes were attacked in the most vicious fashion, African, Indian, and colored. So that when you had a body like what originally was the African Chamber of Commerce emerged in Johannesburg in the 1960s, and then grew into NAFCOC during the mid-60s and 70s, and then you had others during the 1980s like FAPCOS, etc. appearing. The theorists of the Communist Party didn't know what to make of it. And there was sort of this knee-jerk response. Oh, no, Toussaint. Oh, no, capitalists live by exploiting the working class. The black capitalists will do exactly the same. Sure enough, they will. But then strategically and tactically, what do you do in that particular situation, in that conjuncture? They didn't have an answer to that. And had the movement adopted the attitudes of Volpe and Toussaint, we would have had a very, very different outcome. As it is, why the African Chamber of Commerce had to become the National African Federated Chambers of Commerce was because the Bantu authorities, what is it called? Bantu Administration Department had said to them, we're not talking to you as Africans. We recognize different Bantu groups. We want a Zulu Chamber of Commerce. We want a Transkei Chamber of Commerce. We want a Ciskei Chamber of Commerce. We want a Tswana Chamber of Commerce. That's who we deal with, not with an African Chamber of Commerce. That was part of this offensive against the black property classes. The African capitalists didn't respond by saying, yeah, boss, we do that. They said, no, we are not going to have tribal chambers. We are not going to have homeland chambers, but we will try to meet them halfway. We'll ride with the punch by making ourselves a federation of chambers of commerce. That was one response. You look also then at the response when they did now try to establish a relationship with the National Liberation Movement. It was an extremely interesting meeting when we met NAFCOC in Lusaka, watching the members of the Communist Party that one knew in that meeting, and they were at sea, totally at sea. They didn't know what to do, what to think. They didn't know what to make of it. However, we were able to shift NAFCOC into a position where it more or less accepted the leadership of the African National Congress. Consequently, in 1990, when there were those elections in Namibia, and the National Party had cleverly paid everyone who had any form of transport to keep it out of the hands of SWAPO. SWAPO was able to turn to the ANC, and we were able to return to those African capitalists who ran the taxi industry, etc., to provide SWAPO with the transport they needed to be able to fight that election. Had we adopted the attitude of Harold and Toussaint, that would not have been possible. So in a certain respects, you see, I think there was a theoretical poverty in the party in terms of understanding the character of this black petty bourgeoisie and its possibilities, its potential. To be sure, there were elements in that black capitalist class who wanted to collaborate with the regime and would have gladly become that. But you don't just leave them to their own devices or leave them to the tender mercies of the regime. You can't test it. And that was the important thing. And I think that's where the party let the old side down. On the issue of negotiations, I don't think, and maybe it comes back to Janet's point as well that she was talking about why we don't talk about the SACP in Mac and my book. I think the SACP during that period on the issue of negotiations, the way forward, wasn't so much following the ANC lead, but was in concert with the ANC's approach to the whole issue. We did not see struggle and negotiations as opposites. We did not see insurrection and negotiations as opposites. We saw these as terrains of the same struggle. If things go in a particular direction, it can lead to negotiations, which will be a terrain of struggle in which we'll engage. If they go in another direction, it can lead to insurrection, which will obviously terrain of struggle, but will lead to another sort of outcome. But we didn't see these as opposites, and we never approached them as opposites. Part of the reason why one couldn't deal seriously with the South African Communist Party as a separate entity is that when we inquired about the SACP's archives, we were told they'd been given to one scholar and have since disappeared. Maybe Jeremy can enlighten us on that, but the party's archives apparently are unavailable. We were not going to suck things out of our thumbs or try to scratch our heads and remember what the party said about this and that. We wanted archival material. It wasn't available, so we couldn't deal with the party as a separate entity.
Can I come in, Robert?
Yeah, please do. I mean, we do have a couple more questions that I would definitely want to pick up on, if everyone's happy to continue to do so. But Jeremy, yeah, do please come in.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to extend. I mean, first of all, let me agree largely with what Paula was saying on the first matter, which is the frustrated organic emergence of a black capitalist strata, obviously, you know, pummeled into marginalization by the white minority regimes, and not least the apartheid regime. I also agree that there was probably a tendency within the Communist Party to neglect the likely emergence of such a group and its existence, even in the difficult years of the 70s and 80s. But I do want to introduce an additional, which is I didn't get to speak about towards the end of my original input, which is the not organic emergence of a black capitalist stratum, but the deliberate intervention using the ANC and the state from the mid-1990s to create what was supposedly going to be a more patriotic, more developmental bourgeoisie, as opposed to the white counterparts who, you know, with whom there was this expectation, as I said earlier, from the Mbeki circle, that there would be some kind of socioeconomic accord to be connected up with the political and constitutional settlement. And so basically, there was the deliberate attempt through what were called Black economic empowerment policies to use, to basically use regulation to ensure that, to insist or to enforce encumbered shareholdings to pass to politically connected aspirant capitalists without capital. And the second route was obviously through public procurement, using public resources to help to create this nominally and supposedly more patriotic, more ANC-aligned stratum of capitalists. Now, these were essentially what in Marxism, to use Marxist theories, we're asked to talk about that, although Adam Smith was the inventor of the term, primitive accumulation. These were processes of primitive accumulation, which actually resulted in a not developmental or particularly patriotic thing, because one, they were either rather compradorist and reliant on indebted capital shareholdings, basically, with established monopoly capital, which was happy to play this game, the better to prevent fundamental change, but also to have then linkages to the new political reality. And then, of course, the public procurement approach has resulted in, I think, all of the problems, or many of the problems, that the ANC and therefore the broader alliance is currently encountering, of factionism, which is about competition for tenders, for public tenders, competition and so forth. And of course, during the Zuma years, and in particular his second administration, this just took off in terms of industrial scale looting. So I'm not in disagreement with what Paula was saying, that I think the party underestimated the likelihood and importance, for that matter, of the organic emergence. But in a situation where there is 76% youth unemployment in our country, and we're playing electoral politics on a terrain where getting to be in an ANC branch leadership or becoming a councillor and so on becomes, you know, a life and death struggle, literally. I think that particular approach to primitive accumulation in order to ensure politically connected individuals are promoted has had devastating impacts. Yeah, I won't talk about the negotiations thing. I agree with Paula about prior to the development of the Codesa negotiations process, the party was at one with the ANC approach. And I was certainly actually in Lusaka at the time and very, very happy with the direction being provided by Tambo and others. I think during the negotiations, there were sharp differences around how much one needed to ensure that these were people-driven, popular-driven and popularly organized, and not, you know, descending into elite negotiations. And I think that was an uneven process, but I won't talk at length on that. Thanks for letting me in with a second bite. Thank you.
Thank you. No problem. That's great. I will turn now though to a couple of questions that I've received in the chat. First from Robert Edgar, I think actually a very important question. I'll just read it out, which is: despite some prominent women being prominent in the party in its early decades, my impression from my own research on Josie and Palmer has led me to think that the party was highly patriarchal through the 1940s. Do the panelists think this is accurate, and did this change over the subsequent decades? Tom, do you want to start us off?
Question. I mean, I think, I mean, I credit the party for the extent to which women were brought into leadership, but they were still the exception rather than the rule. I mean, one can count the famous names, but if you look at the extent to which women made up the membership of the legal party in the 1940s, and then look at their presence in leadership formations, they are strongly underrepresented. How did that change? Whether it changed? Look, I mean, I think to a much greater extent than we sometimes realize, people in the party were also shaped by the culture that was around them to a very considerable extent. I mean, South Africa was a heavily patriarchal society in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and subsequently. And despite the fact that one has some very strong and assertive women, sometimes in dominant positions in the party, they're not always. Hilda Bernstein, Ruth First, for example, in the 1950s. There are others, Ray Alexander, and so on. There was a division of labor often in the party that, you know, reflected traditional or existing patriarchal attitudes. I mean, how that was obvious sometimes in family relationships, in the kinds of roles that people assumed, the kinds of duties that they performed, and so on. I mean, the party was, to a certain extent, a creature of its time.
Tom, thank you very much. Shall we move on to we have a question from Merle Lipton. Is it not important to distinguish between following communist theory and loyalty to the Soviet Union's line during the Cold War?
No, because much of the communist theory that guided the party, informed its responses in the 1940s, in the 1950s, in the 1960s, came from the Soviet Union. Not all of it, and the party had a remarkable capacity, I think, for developing and building its own theoretical approaches and on strategic issues, or finding its own theoretical base for its strategic decisions that it was making in the 50s and the 60s. But it was also a member, and was consciously a member, of an international communist family, and paid a great deal of attention, sometimes more than its members admitted, to shifts in communist thinking internationally. And much of the shifting came from the Soviet Union, which was a much more creative and intellectually sometimes rather more interesting influence than it was sometimes given credit for, particularly when it came to developmental issues and those concerning the Third World and Africa in particular.
Tom, thank you for that. A comment.
Having said that, yes, of course, sometimes the party responded pragmatically to certain issues where its response was possibly not always wholehearted. For example, the support for the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, that kind of thing. There were sometimes diplomatic requirements, but generally speaking, the party's positioning on theoretical issues through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s was shaped by some of the ideas and some of the thinking that were important in developing communist theory in Moscow and other important centers of the communist movement.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. We a comment from Peter Lim, which I think actually Jeremy Cronin covered to a certain degree in your response to the question about theory just a few minutes ago. Tefo, thank you for your request. If any members of the audience would like to comment on the contribution so far, that would be more than welcome. Martin Janssen, you have a question. The SACP appears to be indistinguishable politically and in its class composition and orientation to the ANC. I'm assuming you mean today in the 2020s. What is in its historical development that contributed to its current state?
I've written 600 pages about how the party developed historically. I don't think it's indistinguishable in terms of its class composition to the ANC. I mean, I'm not quite sure what one means when one talks about the class composition of a party. If one's talking about the sort of sociological characteristics of movements' mass membership, yes, of course. Because approximately 1 in 3 ANC members are probably members of the Communist Party, it's probably quite likely that sociologically the two organizations are fairly similar at the moment. Though I think there may be important differences in the extent to which certain groups make up proportionately parts of the party's following, whether it's unemployed youngsters or whatever it may be. But if one's talking about the party's relationship to particular classes or particular sources of power and influence, I think the two organizations do look a bit different. I mean, the ANC increasingly is a movement, at least at the level of leadership, which is shaped by its connections with business in a way that the party is not. If one, for example, thinks about, if you look at the sort of parliamentary register of interests and look at the sort of, directorate portfolios of individual ANC MPs, I mean, those distinctions become much clearer.
Tom, thank you very much. Paul, Joseph has a question quickly. I think I am aware of the fact that we have overrun our initial the initial allotted time, and you know, someone who has spent quite a lot of time over the past 18 months sitting in front of computer screens, I'm very aware of how tiring this can be. So I'm keen to not kind of press upon everyone and every one of the panelists to just keep going ad infinitum. But I think we can probably take one more question, and if anyone has one other question as well to kind of to finish us off, that would be fine. But we probably should wrap up quite soon. But perhaps we should take Paul's question. Why was there a lack of work carried out by white communists amongst white reactionary people about, by extension, you know, within the white population more broadly? Was it easier for white communists to work amongst black people, black South Africans?
I'll provide the first set of answers. I suspect other people want to say things about this as well. The party was very active amongst reactionary white people during the 1930s, for example, and also during the 1940s. It continued to try and win support within the white labor movement. Much later, sometimes, than some of the party's own accounts or accounts of the party's history written by party members suggest. So it believed that it might be possible to win over a significant segment of the white working class for quite a long time in its history. So I don't think there was that lack of work. By the time the party emerged as an underground formation, it was largely, by that stage, a movement made up of black South Africans, and its orientation and the emphases in its work shifted. On the other hand, I mean, it depends who you mean by reactionary white people, but the party continued to work amongst white South Africans through all of its history, as it continues to do today. It wasn't easy to work for white communists, by the way, to work amongst black people. They found it often very difficult because there were certain things that they needed to learn about. But some white communists, quite early on, to a much greater extent than is supposed, were active amongst black people because they often there's a thesis to be written about the role that shopkeeping played as a vocation for training young white party activists in the 1920s and 1930s, young party activists who often spoke, in addition to English and Yiddish, Basotho or Zulu, because of the jobs that they did on mining concessionary stores as shop assistants serving black customers.
Tom, thank you. Janet, I just spotted that you have your hand up.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to respond to that issue. So there was a very big debate, and I can't say that this debate happened within the party at all, but it certainly happened within the leadership of New SAS and some of us who were involved with UDF, ANC structures and so on. So the debate was, should we focus on organizing within our own constituency, i.e. white students and then the broader white population? Was that the strategic priority, to divide the ruling bloc, as we use that term, or should we be focusing on, some people emphasized the importance of organizing the working class and building independent trade unions, and some people said the focus should be on MK, you know, on military work. So I think I'm speculating here, and you're welcome to prove me wrong, but I think there could have been much more emphasis on organizing among whites, especially the military. So End Conscription campaign and that whole strategy was a carefully thought out strategy, and there were communists involved in that. I know some of the party members who were involved in that strategy, but again, it wasn't done as a Communist Party strategy. It was done as part of a broader liberation movement strategy. I think it could have anyway, it could have been done in other ways. That strategy could have been furthered in other directions, but it wasn't. I think there was a bit of a militarist tendency or domination within the party. Oh.
Janet, thank you so much. I can't see any more questions. There is an important announcement that Ariana has put into the chat relating to a webinar tomorrow that's co-organised by SAHO, the Wits History Workshop, Department of History at the University of the Free State, and Department of Development Studies at NMU, and the Archie Mafiji Chair in Critical Humanities and the AC Jordan Chair at Centre for African Studies at UCT and the Department of History at the University of Joburg to mark the centenary of the history of the South African Communist Party. And there's a link to the talk tomorrow. So please do, if you want to join the meeting tomorrow, please do click on the link in the chat. And we have I believe, Paolo, did you raise your hand briefly a second ago? Did you want to come in quickly on that former last comment?
Yes, it is on this issue of white communists organizing amongst whites. The purpose of a communist party is to reach and mobilize the working class. Now, if the vast majority, overwhelming majority of the working class is not white and is black, why would any communist want to devote time to organizing the minority rather than the majority? I mean, I think that's just the question that people should think about. I don't think, we should have this approach, almost like a Bantu homelands approach to politics. Whites must organize whites, Africans must organize Africans, Indians must organize Indians, colors. No, that was never the approach of our movement. And thank goodness it was not the approach of the Communist Party. Now, to be sure, in the early days, because as I said, the Communist Party of South Africa is a creature of the Second International, which, as I said, was very much a European white people's international rather than an international. They did focus on the white working class. And I think up to the time of about the Fourth Congress of the Communist International, you still have someone like David Ivan Jones in Moscow saying the leaders of the revolution in South Africa would be the white workers. So there was that tendency. Now, by hard experience, I think the Communist Party learned that the white working class was not going to be very receptive to its message. It was clear by the 1950s that it was not going to be very receptive to its message. And consequently, the concentration was on the black working class. But that was where the industrial proletariat were in any case. The white working class, I don't know if people remember Caesar Manzi is Dead, that play. There's a character in there called Mr. Bas Bradley. Mr. Bas Bradley actually is a white worker. Let's remember that, but he's called Mr. and Bas by the other workers. And that says something about why white communists would tend to organize black workers rather than Mr. Bas Bradley.
Thank you very, very much. I was just sorry. I sounded slightly distracted. Then I was tempted. I was talking this afternoon to master students about Frantz Fanon and Frantz Fanon's kind of blending of Marxist theory with his own kind of particular thoughts on colonialism and similar ideas were involved in our discussion. So I was slightly distracted as to why my different themes seem to be overlapping in my life this afternoon. Thank you all so much for your contributions. As I say, this is, you've given so much of your time this afternoon, and I'm very, very, very grateful to you all. Thank you for everyone for staying with us and for joining us and staying with us, for your questions. But most of all, thank you all. Thank you in particular to Tom for the work you've done and for the 600 pages that you've been produced, and good luck with the publication of the book. I hope it goes really well, and I hope everyone buys it. Thank you, Tom.
We don't have to do that, but thank you all very much.
With that, I declare our proceedings closed. Thank you all.
Yeah. Jana, Jeremy, Paolo, and Robert, thanks very much indeed, and Ariana.
You're most welcome.
Thank you.
The Togliatti piece you'll find in Jane Degra's collection.
Right, you are. And
Yeah.
it'll be on my reading list